Welcome to the channel. I know many of you listen to these videos to relax or fall asleep, and I'm really glad you're here. Before we start today's crime stories, please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. And if there's any crime story you'd like me to narrate for you, feel free to request it in the comment section. Now let's begin. Story 1. Goran Jelicic was born on June 7, 1968, in the town of Bijeljina. This town was part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was then one of the republics of Yugoslavia. His father, Aleksandar, worked as an accountant. His mother, Ivanka, took care of the home. The family was not rich, but they were not poor either. They were a working family. Goran was the second child. He was raised by his parents and also spent much time with his grandmother. Bijeljina was a mixed town. About 40 out of every 100 people were Bosniaks, who are mostly Muslim. The other people were mainly Serbs, who are mostly Orthodox Christian. Goran grew up in this mixed environment. As a boy and a young man, he had friends from both groups. He played and spent time with both Serb and Bosniak children. His childhood was, in this way, normal for the place he lived. He went to elementary school in Bijeljina. After that, he attended a secondary agricultural school. He was not a very good student. He did not enjoy school and did not get high grades. He finished his schooling, but did not go to university. After school, he needed to find work. Goran Jelicic did not have a stable career. He worked different jobs, often for short periods. His father would find him work, but Goran would not stay in one job for long. He worked as a farmhand, doing physical labor on farms. He also worked as a mechanic for a time. He changed jobs frequently. He did not show a strong interest in building a career or learning a skilled trade. Outside of work, Goran had a hobby he enjoyed very much. He liked fishing. He was part of local fishing groups. He would spend his free time fishing with other men. The men in these fishing groups, both Serbs and Bosniaks, liked him. They saw him as a normal friend. They later said he was a good person to be around when they were fishing. When he was a young adult, Goran did something illegal. He committed check fraud. This means he wrote checks for money he did not have in his bank account. This is a crime of theft. Because of this, he was arrested. He was put on trial, found guilty, and sent to prison. He spent some time in prison for this fraud. This was his only known crime before the war. In February 1992, Goran Jelicic was released from prison. He returned to his life in Bijeljina. The political situation in Yugoslavia was becoming very tense at this time. Different ethnic groups were arguing about the future of the country. There was fear and suspicion growing between people. For Goran, after leaving prison, he needed to decide what to do next with his life. After his release from prison in February 1992, Goran Jelicic returned to a country that was beginning to fracture. In Bosnia, tensions between ethnic Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats were turning into violence. In April 1992, Serb political leaders created a new entity called the Republika Srpska, separate from Bosnia. Many Serb men volunteered or were recruited to fight for this cause. Jelicic decided to volunteer. On April 30, 1992, he arrived in the strategic town of Brčko. Brčko sits on an important road and river crossing. Serb forces wanted to control it to connect two parts of their territory. Very soon after Jelicic arrived, Serb military and police began rounding up non-Serb civilians, mainly Bosniaks and some Croats. They needed a place to hold these detainees. They chose an industrial complex known as the Luka Camp. This was a collection of warehouses and hangars next to the river port. Jelicic was given a role at this camp. He was not a high-ranking officer. He was a guard and an interrogator. He was given a uniform and a weapon. He quickly became known for his extreme brutality. He began to call himself the Serb Adolf Hitler. He told people his goal was to kill Muslims, which is the term for Bosniaks. The Luka camp was not designed for long-term holding. It was overcrowded, with hundreds of men kept in dirty hangars with little food or water. Every day, Jelačić would enter the main hangar. He would walk among the tired, scared detainees. He would pick out individuals. Sometimes he chose people at random. Sometimes he chose people whose names he knew from before the war. He would take them out for what he called interrogation. The interrogation was almost always a violent beating. He used tools he found around the industrial site. He beat men with metal pipes, wooden sticks, and heavy tools. He did this to inflict pain and to humiliate them. After beating them, he often shot them. He carried a pistol. He would execute detainees by shooting them in the head or the chest. He did this almost every day. One specific event happened on May 7, 1992, just a week after he arrived. Jelačić took two Bosniak men, Hadrudin Musarovic and Hussein Krso, from the camp. He led them to the Zanatsky Center, a building in Brčko. There, in the street, he shot and killed both men. A photographer took a picture of one of the victims lying on the ground. This photograph would later become famous as evidence of the war's cruelty. Jelačić did not act alone all the time. He had a girlfriend with him in Brčko named Monica. She was involved in the camp's activities. She also beat and mistreated detainees. Jelačić himself was violent toward her as well, but she participated in the abuse of the prisoners. Despite his cruelty to most detainees, Jelačić sometimes showed a different side to people he knew from before the war. If he recognized a Bosniak man from his hometown or from his fishing group, he might help them. In a few cases, he gave money to the wives of old friends to help them escape. He helped one friend's sister leave the area safely. But these acts were exceptions. For the vast majority of prisoners, he was a source of terror. His routine continued for weeks. Enter the hangar, select prisoners, beat them, kill them. He once beat an elderly Bosniak man to death using a metal pipe, a shovel, and a wooden stick. The camp was full of the sounds of his violence. Other guards and camp officials saw what he was doing. They did not stop him. His actions were tolerated because they fit the atmosphere of fear and hatred that the camp was designed to create. The detainees were powerless. They could only wait and hope they were not chosen. The crimes at the Luka camp did not remain a secret. When the war in Bosnia ended in 1995, international organizations began to investigate the atrocities that had occurred. The United Nations established a special court called the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in The Hague. This court was tasked with finding and trying the people most responsible for war crimes. Evidence from the Luka camp, including witness statements and photographs, was gathered by investigators. One important piece of evidence was a photograph taken by journalist Bojan Stojanović in May 1992. It showed the body of one of the men Goran Jelačić had executed at the Zanatsky Center. This photograph, seen worldwide, helped draw attention to the horrors in Brčko. As investigators worked, they collected names. The name Goran Jelačić, the self-proclaimed Serb Adolf Hitler, kept appearing in witness accounts from the camp. Survivors described his daily selections and killings in detail. A covert operation to arrest him was planned by United States forces. The operation was codenamed Amber Light. On January 22, 1998, the plan was executed. A U.S. Navy SEAL team, along with intelligence officers, surrounded Jelačić's apartment in his hometown of Bijeljina. He was taken into custody without a fight. This was the first time U.S. forces had directly captured a Bosnian war crime suspect. He was quickly flown to the ICTY detention unit in the Netherlands to face trial. At his trial, Goran Jelačić decided to plead guilty. He admitted to the facts of his actions at the Luka camp. He pleaded guilty to 15 counts of crimes against humanity and 16 counts of violating the laws or customs of war. These charges covered the beatings, torture, and murders he committed. However, he did not plead guilty to one charge, genocide. The prosecution argued that his goal of killing Muslims was genocide, but Jelačić denied this specific legal charge. The judges listened to all the evidence. They heard from many survivors of the Luka camp. They reviewed the photographic evidence. In 1999, the court delivered its verdict. Because he had pleaded guilty, he was convicted on the 31 counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes. The court found that while his acts were horrific and widespread, the prosecution did not prove the specific intent for genocide beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, he was acquitted on the genocide charge. For his crimes, the court sentenced Goran Jelačić to 40 years in prison. This was the longest sentence the tribunal had given at that time. The judges also recommended he receive psychiatric treatment during his imprisonment. In 2001, an appeals court upheld this sentence. In 2003, he was transferred to a prison in Italy to serve his term, with credit for the time he had already spent in detention since 1998. Later, Jelačić's actions after his own trial were noted. He testified as a character witness at the trial of a Bosniak war criminal, speaking in his defense because that person had shown kindness to fellow prisoners in The Hague. Jelačić also applied for early release several times after serving 2/3 of his sentence. His applications in 2017 and 2021 were rejected. A final request in 2025 was also denied, meaning he is expected to remain in prison for the full duration of his sentence. The victims of his crimes were remembered by their families and by organizations dedicated to justice. Every year, commemorations are held at the sites of the killings in Brčko, calling for permanent memorials to honor those who were lost. Goran Jelačić remains in prison, serving the sentence for the brutal crimes he committed during a few months in 1992. Story 2. Ante Gotovina was born on October 12, 1955, in a small coastal village named Tkan. Tkan was on an island called Pasman, which was part of the country of Yugoslavia. His family life was difficult from the beginning. His father, Milan, had tried to move the family to Italy for a better life, but was caught by border police. Milan spent time in prison for this. When Annie was nearly 4 years old, a terrible accident happened. He was with his mother at a construction site. There was an unexpected explosion. His mother pushed him to safety, but was killed herself. This event left a deep mark on his early childhood. After his mother's death, his father went to the city of Zagreb to work. Ante and his brothers and sisters could not go with him. They went to live with their mother's father, their grandfather, in a nearby village called Pakistan. He grew up there by the sea. As a boy, Ante was restless. He did not like being confined. One time, around Easter in 1971 when he was a teenager, he and a friend decided to run away. They took a small boat and tried to sail away from their village. They wanted to find a different life, but the weather turned bad. A storm made the sea very rough and dangerous. They could not go on and had to turn their boat back. They returned home quietly. Ante never told his grandfather about this attempt. He continued to go to school in the city of Zadar, where he was studying to be an electrician. However, Ante did not want to be an electrician. When he was 16 years old, he left home for good. He found work as a sailor on ships. This job took him to different countries. In 1973, before his 18th birthday, he made a big decision. He went to France and joined the French Foreign Legion. The Legion was a special part of the French army that accepted foreigners. He used a false name, Andrea Grabovac, when he joined. Life in the Foreign Legion was tough and disciplined. Ante was trained as a paratrooper, a soldier who jumps from planes. He became very good at it. He was chosen for an elite commando unit within the Legion. He served for 5 years. During this time, he was sent on missions to Africa. He saw combat in places like Djibouti and Zaire. He left the Legion with the rank of senior corporal. Because of his service, he was allowed to become a French citizen in 1979. After leaving the army, Anty stayed in France. He needed work. He began working for private security companies. These companies were hired to protect people, buildings, and events. Through this work, he sometimes provided security for important and controversial French politicians. This work connected him to different people in France. During the 1980s, Inigo Tuvina got into trouble with the law. French police records show he was involved in serious crimes. He was accused of robbery and extortion, which is getting money from people through threats. There were warrants for his arrest. It was reported that he was convicted and served a 2-year prison sentence, though he later denied this. In the late 1980s, he left Europe. He went to South America. There, he used his military knowledge to train paramilitary groups in countries like Argentina and Guatemala. In South America, he met a woman, married her, and they had a daughter. He was arrested during a trip back to France. In 1986, a French court found him guilty and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. However, he was released from prison the very next year, in 1987. Some reports suggested that powerful people helped him get out early. In early August 1995, Inigo Tuvina was a high-ranking general in the Croatian army. He was placed in command of a major military offensive called Operation Storm. The goal of this operation was to take back a region of Croatia known as the Krajina, which was controlled by Serbian rebel forces. The plan was to attack quickly and with great force. The operation began on the morning of August 4th. General Gotovina was in direct command of the forces attacking the city of Nin, which was the capital of the rebel territory. One of the first actions was a large-scale artillery attack. Many shells were fired into Nin. The official military target was the communications and command centers of the Serbian forces. However, the shells did not only hit these military targets. The shelling was widespread and hit civilian areas of the city. Homes, apartments, and other non-military buildings were damaged or destroyed. This caused panic among the Serbian civilians living in Nin. As the Croatian army advanced, the Serbian military forces retreated quickly. They offered little resistance. This allowed the Croatian soldiers to move into towns and villages across the Krajina region at high speed. In many places, the Serbian civilian population, seeing their army leave and fearing the incoming Croatian troops, began to flee their homes. They left in cars, tractors, and on foot, forming long columns of refugees heading east. During and after the military advance, crimes were committed against the Serbian civilians who remained behind. These crimes were not isolated incidents, but happened in numerous villages across the region. Croatian soldiers entered Serbian homes. They killed some civilians execution style, often shooting them at close range. Some elderly men and women were killed inside their own houses. Other civilians were taken from their homes, led into nearby fields or forests, and shot. In some cases, houses and farm buildings belonging to Serbian families were set on fire, often with the property still inside. The crimes also included theft on a large scale, which is called plunder. After Serbian families fled or were killed, soldiers and other Croat civilians entered the empty homes. They stole everything of value: furniture, televisions, livestock, and personal belongings. They would load trucks with stolen goods and drive away. Entire villages were stripped bare. The overall effect of Operation Storm, under Gotovina's command, was the forcible and permanent removal of the Serbian population from the Krajina region. The combination of the heavy shelling of Nin, the killings of civilians, the burning of homes, and the widespread plunder created an atmosphere of terror. This terror made the Serbian population believe they could not stay and must flee for their lives. In a matter of a few days, approximately 200,000 Serbian civilians were displaced from their homes and became refugees. At the time, international observers and news reporters witnessed the aftermath. They saw the columns of refugees and the burning villages. They reported on the killings and the theft. The Croatian government stated that Operation Storm was a legitimate military action to reclaim its territory, and that any crimes were the unauthorized acts of individual soldiers. However, prosecutors would later argue that the widespread and similar nature of the crimes in many different towns indicated they were part of a planned, systematic effort to remove the Serbian population. For several years after Operation Storm, Ante Gotovina was a celebrated military hero in Croatia. He held a senior position in the army. This changed in 2001. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, a United Nations court located in The Hague, Netherlands, began investigating the events of August 1995. The ICTY prosecutors gathered evidence from the Krajina region. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses who had fled, including people who saw family members killed or whose homes were destroyed. They collected documents, military orders, and photographs of the damage. Based on this investigation, the ICTY prosecutors decided that the crimes were not just random acts by soldiers. They believed the violence and expulsions were part of a planned joint criminal enterprise. They alleged that Ante Gotovina, as the commanding general, was responsible for these crimes. In July 2001, the ICTY issued a sealed, or secret, indictment against Gotovina for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Croatian government was given the indictment and asked to arrest him. When Gotovina learned about this, he disappeared. He did not surrender to the court. For the next 4 years, Gotovina was a fugitive. The ICTY made the indictment public. An international arrest warrant was issued through Interpol. The United States government offered a reward of $5 million for information leading to his capture. The European Union told Croatia that it could not begin talks to join the EU until Gotovina was arrested and sent to The Hague. Croatian police claimed they did not know where he was. Some people in Croatia helped to hide him. During this time, he moved between different countries using false passports. His capture happened because of international police cooperation. Spanish intelligence and police agencies were monitoring people connected to Gotovina. They placed a wiretap on the telephone of his wife. Through listening to these calls, they got information about his location. On December 7, 2005, Spanish police found him in a hotel room in the Playa de las Americas resort on Tenerife, one of the Canary Islands. He was arrested without a fight. He was carrying a large amount of cash and fake passports with different names. Within days, he was flown to the Netherlands and placed in the ICTY detention unit. His trial did not start immediately. It took time for his lawyers and the prosecutors to prepare. The trial finally began in March 2008. It was combined with the cases of 2 other Croatian officials. The trial lasted for over 2 years. Prosecutors presented evidence of the shelling of Nin, showing maps and expert witnesses who argued that the artillery fire was not aimed only at military targets. They showed lists of the names of hundreds of murdered civilians. They played video footage of villages on fire and presented documents about military movements. Gotovina's defense lawyers argued that Operation Storm was a lawful military operation to take back Croatian land. They said the shelling was aimed at legitimate military positions, and any civilian damage was an accident of war. They argued that the crimes against civilians were terrible, but were committed by individual soldiers without orders from Gotovina. They said he could not control every soldier in a fast-moving war. They claimed the mass exodus of Serbs was caused by panic and orders from the Serbian rebel leadership, not by a plan from the Croatian army. In April 2011, the trial chamber of the ICTY announced its verdict. The 3-judge panel found Ante Gotovina guilty on 8 of 9 counts. They ruled that the artillery attack on Nin was unlawful because it was deliberately aimed at the town itself, not specific military targets. They found that this attack was the start of a joint criminal enterprise to permanently remove the Serb population from the Krajina. As a leader of this enterprise, Gotovina was found guilty for the murders, the deportations, and the plunder that followed. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison. This verdict caused massive protests in Croatia, where many people still saw him as a hero. However, the case was not over. Gotovina's lawyers appealed the verdict to a different, higher panel of ICTY judges. This appeals panel re-examined the evidence, especially about the artillery attacks. In November 2012, the appeals court announced its decision. By a vote of 3-2, it overturned the guilty verdict. The appeals judges ruled that the trial judges had made an error in deciding the artillery fire was unlawful. They said the prosecution did not prove there was a criminal plan to expel the Serb population. Therefore, Ante Gotovina was found not guilty. He was released from prison immediately after nearly 7 years in detention. A Croatian government airplane was sent to bring him home. He returned to Croatia to a hero's welcome. Tens of thousands of people greeted him in the main square of the capital, Zagreb. He received honorary citizenship from several cities. Since his release, he has lived as a free man in Croatia. The appeals court's decision was final, and no further charges could be brought against him for these events at the ICTY. The legal case reached its conclusion with his acquittal and release. The story of Ante Gotovina concluded with his return to Croatia as a free man after an international court overturned his war crimes conviction. Story 3. Curtis Moore was born on February 26, 1968, in Tarrant County, Texas. He grew up in the city of Fort Worth. The details about his parents and any siblings are not widely recorded, but it is known he lived with his family as a child. His troubles with the law began at a very young age. When Curtis Moore was 12 years old, he was detained by authorities for running away from home. This resulted in him being placed in a juvenile detention center for a period of time. After this, he was released back to the care of his parents. The following year, at age 13, his behavior led to another intervention. He was detained for being incorrigible, which means he was considered unmanageable or uncontrollable. Because of this, his parents agreed to a voluntary commitment. He was sent to a juvenile home called Boysville in San Antonio, Texas. He stayed there for 6 months before being released back to his parents. His criminal activity escalated as a teenager. At age 15, he was detained for stealing a bicycle. This act of theft resulted in his commitment to the Texas Youth Commission, which is the state's juvenile corrections system. He served 6 months there. After his release, he was placed on juvenile parole. He completed this parole successfully, meaning he followed the rules for a time and was not sent back. When he became a young adult, his offenses became more serious. In 1985, when he was 17 years old, he was charged and sentenced as an adult. He received a 6-year prison sentence for robbery by threats. He entered the Texas Department of Criminal Justice prison system. His time in the adult prison system began a long pattern of being released and then returning. He was released on mandatory supervision in March 1987, after serving about 2 years of his 6-year sentence. However, his freedom was short-lived. By September of that same year, he was arrested again. He was convicted of theft of property valued over $750. For this crime, he received a 2-year sentence and was returned to prison. He was released on parole in July 1988. Again, he did not remain out for long. In October 1988, he violated his parole and was returned to custody. This time, it was for a new 15-year sentence for theft from a person. He was released on parole for this sentence in April 1990. His cycle of crime and prison continued. In January 1991, his parole was revoked again. He was returned to prison to serve a 15-year sentence for two crimes: possession of cocaine and possession of a weapon by a felon. The weapon was a .357 Magnum pistol. He served about 4.5 years of this sentence. Curtis Moore was released on parole from this sentence in March 1995. He was 27 years old. He returned to Fort Worth. Curtis Moore had been out on parole for 8 months when, on the evening of November 29, 1995, he met with his 17-year-old nephew, Anthony Moore. Curtis was 27 years old. They planned to meet with 3 other men: Darrell Hoyle, 21, Henry Trevelyan Jr., 20, and Roderick Moore, 24, who was not related to Curtis. The purpose of the meeting was to arrange a deal for cocaine. The 5 men agreed to meet at a house on Pate Street in Fort Worth. This house belonged to Curtis Moore's sister. Darrell Hoyle drove his beige, 4-door Oldsmobile Cutlass. His friends Henry Trevelyan and Roderick Moore rode with him. Curtis and his nephew Anthony arrived in a blue Oldsmobile that Curtis said he had borrowed from a friend. When they first arrived at the Pate Street house, Darrell Hoyle and Anthony Moore stayed outside and talked for a few minutes. Curtis Moore, Henry Trevelyan, and Roderick Moore went inside the house. After about 5 minutes, Darrell and Anthony also went inside. All 5 men were then in the kitchen. After talking in the kitchen for a while, Curtis Moore and his nephew Anthony went into the bathroom together. Moments later, Curtis came out of the bathroom alone. He was holding a gun. He shouted, "This is a jack." This is street language for announcing a robbery. He then took money from 2 of the men. He took $150 from Darrell Hoyle and $5 from Henry Trevelyan. While Curtis Moore pointed the gun at Darrell, Henry, and Roderick, he told his nephew Anthony to tie them up. Anthony Moore then used something to tie the hands and feet of the 3 victims. With the 3 men bound, Curtis Moore put Darrell Hoyle and Henry Trevelyan into the trunk of Darrell's own beige Cutlass. He put Roderick Moore into the back seat of the same car. Curtis Moore got into the driver's seat of the Cutlass. His nephew Anthony sat in the front passenger seat, holding the gun. They drove away from the Pate Street house with Roderick Moore as a captive in the back seat and the other 2 men locked in the trunk. After driving for a while, Curtis Moore stopped the car. He said the car was out of gasoline. He told Anthony to keep the gun pointed at Roderick Moore in the back seat. Curtis then left to get gasoline. He returned about 10 minutes later, put gasoline into the car, and continued driving. The car made another stop later. From inside the trunk, Darrell Hoyle heard a woman scream after the sound of a gunshot. He believed they were at Roderick Moore's home, and that the scream came from Roderick's girlfriend, LaTanya Boone. Darrell Hoyle did not hear LaTanya or Roderick again after this. He assumed they were put into another vehicle. The car stopped once more. Curtis Moore opened the trunk and asked Darrell and Henry if they were trying to get loose. He then closed the trunk and continued driving. Around 2 o'clock in the morning on November 30th, Curtis Moore stopped the car on Wilbarga Street in southeast Tarrant County. He got out of the car. Darrell Hoyle, from inside the trunk, heard the trunk open. Curtis Moore then fired a gun into the trunk. Henry Trevelyan was shot. He said, "Oh, I'm hit." Curtis Moore closed the trunk. Curtis Moore opened the trunk again. He had a container of gasoline. He poured the gasoline over Darrell Hoyle and the wounded Henry Trevelyan. He then partly closed the trunk lid, leaving it open just enough to put his hand inside. Darrell Hoyle heard the flick of a lighter. Immediately, his and Henry's clothes caught on fire. Curtis Moore tried to slam the trunk lid shut, but Darrell Hoyle kicked it violently from inside until it opened. Despite being tied, Darrell managed to pull himself and Henry Trevelyan out of the burning trunk. Both men were on fire. They ran from the car. Henry Trevelyan, realizing he was on fire, dropped to the ground and tried to roll to put out the flames. Darrell Hoyle ran across the street and into a wooded area. Curtis Moore chased him. When Curtis Moore caught up to Darrell in the woods, he stepped on Darrell's neck. He threatened to kill him. Darrell Hoyle pretended to be dead. Believing him dead, Curtis Moore walked back toward the cars. When Curtis Moore was gone, Darrell Hoyle got up and ran farther into the woods to hide. From his hiding place, he saw his car burning. He then saw what looked like an explosion. He saw Curtis Moore take off his shirt and yell that he was going to kill Darrell. Darrell Hoyle then heard sirens. He saw Curtis Moore run toward a highway. He also saw a blue Oldsmobile, like the one from earlier, drive toward the highway. Fire trucks and police cars arrived at the burning car on Wilbarger Street. Darrell Hoyle, badly burned, came out of the woods and approached the emergency workers. He was able to tell a fireman his name and Henry Trevilian's name. He could not give more information because he was in shock. He had burns on about 60% of his body. He was taken to a hospital by helicopter. Henry Trevilian was found dead at the scene. He died from multiple gunshot wounds to his chest and abdomen, as well as from burns and smoke inhalation. Later that same morning, police were called to another location on David Strickland Street, not far from Wilbarger Street. There, they found 2 more bodies in a roadside ditch. The bodies were those of Roderick Moore and his girlfriend, LaTanya Boone, 21. Both had been shot to death with a 9mm pistol. Darrell Hoyle remained unconscious in the hospital for 6 days. 6 days after the attack, Darrell Hoyle regained consciousness in the hospital. As soon as he was able, he gave a detailed statement to the police. He described the 2 attackers. He told police that the younger one was named Anthony, but he knew him by the street name Kojak. He said Anthony attended O.D. Wyatt High School. Darrell did not know the older attacker's name, but he told police the man drove a distinctive pink pickup truck. Police used this information. They went to the high school and quickly identified Anthony Kojak Moore. They found and arrested Anthony Moore. After his arrest, Anthony Moore provided information to the police. He led them to the older attacker, his uncle Curtis Moore. Police also connected Curtis Moore to the pink truck Darrell Hoyle had described. On December 12, 1995, police arrested Curtis Moore. When they arrested him, they noticed he had recent burns on his hands and arms. After his arrest, Anthony Moore led police to a specific location where he had hidden the murder weapon. He showed them a 9mm pistol. Ballistics tests later proved this was the gun used to shoot and kill Roderick Moore and LaTanya Boone. Curtis Moore and Anthony Moore were both charged with capital murder. In November 1996, Curtis Moore stood trial. During the trial, he admitted to holding the victims at gunpoint and ordering them to be tied up. However, he blamed the murders on his nephew, Anthony. He claimed the gunfire and the fire were Anthony's doing. He said his own burns happened because he tried to rescue the victims from the burning car. The jury did not believe his story. They found Curtis Moore guilty of capital murder. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved to a punishment phase to decide his sentence. Prosecutors showed the jury Curtis Moore's long history of criminal convictions and violence. They also presented evidence that while he was in jail waiting for this trial, he stabbed another inmate with a pen during a game of dominoes. The jury decided on the death penalty. Anthony Moore, the nephew, chose to make a plea agreement with prosecutors before his own trial. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. In exchange for his plea and his testimony, he was given 2 life sentences in prison instead of facing the death penalty. After his death sentence, Curtis Moore began a long process of appeals. His lawyers argued that he should not be executed because he might be mentally retarded. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that executing mentally retarded individuals was unconstitutional. Multiple courts reviewed evidence about Curtis Moore's intelligence. They looked at IQ tests from his childhood and adulthood. Some tests showed low scores, while others did not. Different doctors gave different opinions. The courts ultimately ruled that Curtis Moore was not mentally retarded. A federal court wrote that while some evidence might point to mild intellectual problems, there was ample evidence that he was not retarded. All of his appeals were eventually denied. On January 14, 2009, Curtis Moore was executed by lethal injection at the state prison in Huntsville, Texas. In the execution room, a woman named Irene Wilcox, who provided spiritual care to death row inmates, watched through a window. Curtis Moore's final statement was to thank her for her friendship and ministry. He did not acknowledge Darrell Hoyle, who was present, or the family members of his victims who were also there. The lethal injection was administered, and he was pronounced dead at 6:21 p.m. Anthony Moore remains in the Texas prison system, serving his 2 life sentences. Darrell Hoyle survived his severe burns and testified at the trial. The legal process concluded with the execution of Curtis Moore. Story 4. Osama bin Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957, in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. His father, Mohammed bin Laden, was a Yemeni immigrant who built a massive construction company. His mother, Hamida al-Attaz, was his father's 10th wife. She was from Syria. His parents divorced shortly after his birth. Hamida then married a man named Muhammad al-Attaz. Osama grew up in this new household in the city of Jeddah, alongside his mother's new children, his half-siblings. The bin Laden family was extremely wealthy and powerful. The family business worked closely with the Saudi royal family, building palaces and holy sites. Osama's father died in a plane crash when Osama was 10 years old. The father's wealth was divided among his many children. Osama eventually inherited a fortune estimated to be tens of millions of dollars. This money gave him financial independence for his entire life. He was raised as a devout Muslim. From 1968 to 1976, he attended the Al-Thajer Model School in Jeddah. It was a prestigious private school. During the summers, he sometimes traveled for study. For example, in 1971, he took an English language course in Oxford, England. After finishing school, he enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah to study economics and business administration. At university, his main interest shifted from business to religion. He began to study Islamic law and history intensely. He was influenced by 2 teachers in particular. One was a popular Islamic scholar named Abdullah Azam. The other was the writings of Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian thinker who believed Muslim societies had become corrupted by Western ideas. Osama became very serious and religious during this time. He was known to be quiet, polite, and generous with his money among his friends. In his personal life, he married his first cousin, Najwa Ghanem, when he was 17 years old. This was an arranged marriage, common in his culture. He would eventually have multiple wives and many children. Those who knew him described him as a strict but caring father. He enjoyed simple hobbies like horseback riding, writing poetry, and playing soccer. He was very tall and thin, and he usually carried a walking cane. A key event happened in 1979. The Soviet Union invaded the country of Afghanistan to support a communist government there. Many Muslims around the world saw this as an attack on Islam. Osama, then in his early 20s, left university before formally graduating. He felt a strong religious duty to help the Afghan people fight the invaders. He used his family's construction company to move equipment to Pakistan, which bordered Afghanistan. He then used his personal money to buy weapons and supplies for the Afghan fighters, known as Mujahideen. During the 1980s, he spent long periods in Pakistan and sometimes inside Afghanistan. He helped organize and pay for Arab volunteers who wanted to join the fight. He built roads and shelters for them. He even fought in a few battles himself, like the Battle of Jaji in 1987. This experience changed him. He went from being a rich businessman's son to a fighter in a holy war. He earned a reputation among the volunteers as a brave and dedicated leader. The war against the Soviets ended in 1989, and the foreign fighters withdrew. Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia, seen by some as a hero of jihad. Upon his return to Saudi Arabia in 1989, Osama bin Laden was angered by the political situation in the Middle East. His discontent grew significantly in 1990 when Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. This put Saudi Arabia at risk. The Saudi royal family decided to allow hundreds of thousands of U.S. and other foreign troops to be based on Saudi soil to protect the kingdom. Bin Laden saw this as a grave offense. He believed the land containing Islam's two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, was being defiled by the presence of non-Muslim soldiers. He offered to use his network of Afghan war veterans to defend Saudi Arabia instead, but the Saudi government rejected his offer. This rejection deepened his hatred for the Saudi monarchy and its ally, the United States. He began to publicly criticize the government. Because of his outspoken opposition, the Saudi authorities placed him under a form of house arrest and took away his passport. In 1991, he managed to leave Saudi Arabia by leveraging his family connections. He first went to Afghanistan, but it was unstable, so he soon moved with a group of loyal followers to the country of Sudan in northeast Africa. In Sudan, bin Laden used his wealth to build businesses and farms. More importantly, he used this base to formally organize the group that had begun in the late 1980s. This group was called Al-Qaeda, which means the base. Its goal was to create a global jihad, or holy war, to remove Western influence from Muslim countries and to overthrow governments it considered corrupt. Al-Qaeda operated as a network, training fighters, forging passports, and moving money. During this time, Al-Qaeda provided support to other militant groups in places like Algeria, Egypt, and Yemen. The presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia continued to be his primary grievance. In August 1996, he issued his first public declaration of war, called a fatwa, from Afghanistan, where he had returned after pressure from the U.S. forced Sudan to ask him to leave. The fatwa was titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Mosques. In it, he stated it was the religious duty of every Muslim to kill American soldiers and civilians to force the U.S. military out of Saudi Arabia. His calls for violence became more direct and global. In February 1998, he and other extremist leaders formed the World Islamic Front for Jihad against Jews and Crusaders. They issued another fatwa. This one stated that killing Americans and their allies, both military and civilian, was an individual duty for Muslims anywhere it could be done. This was a clear instruction for global terrorism. Al-Qaeda acted on this declaration. On August 7, 1998, simultaneous truck bomb attacks occurred at the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The massive bombs detonated near the embassy buildings. The explosion in Nairobi was particularly devastating, causing a nearby building to collapse. In total, 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans, and over 4,000 people were wounded. The vast majority of the victims were local African civilians, clerks, diplomats, passers-by, and students. 2 years later, on October 12, 2000, Al-Qaeda operatives attacked the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer that was refueling in the port of Aden, Yemen. The attackers used a small boat loaded with explosives to pull up alongside the warship and detonate it. The blast tore a huge hole in the side of the ship, killing 17 American sailors and injuring 39 others. The ship was nearly sunk. These attacks demonstrated Al-Qaeda's growing ambition and capability. Meanwhile, in hidden camps in Afghanistan, a much larger plot was underway. Bin Laden and his deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, approved a plan presented by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. The plan involved using hijacked passenger airplanes as weapons. Young men from several Arab countries were recruited and sent to flight schools in the United States to learn how to pilot, though not land, large aircraft. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 al-Qaeda hijackers boarded 4 domestic U.S. flights. After the planes reached cruising altitude, the hijackers took control using small knives and box cutters. They claimed they had bombs, though they did not. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 was flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 was flown into the South Tower. The impacts caused massive fires. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 was flown into the Pentagon, the U.S. military headquarters in Virginia. The fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was targeting Washington, D.C., but passengers fought the hijackers. It crashed into a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m. The burning jet fuel weakened the steel structures of the World Trade Center towers. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. The attacks resulted in the deaths of 2,977 people from over 90 countries. They were office workers, firefighters, police officers, restaurant staff, and passengers. The Pentagon attack killed 184 people. The crash of Flight 93 killed all 40 people on board. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in world history. The investigation began immediately on September 11, 2001. Within hours, U.S. intelligence agencies identified al-Qaeda as the prime suspect, based on intercepted communications and the known history of the group. By the end of the day, Osama bin Laden was named the chief suspect. The United States demanded that Afghanistan's Taliban government, which harbored bin Laden and al-Qaeda, hand him over. The Taliban refused, asking for evidence first, which the U.S. rejected. In response, the United States launched a military invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, with the goals of dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power. U.S. and allied forces quickly overthrew the Taliban government and scattered al-Qaeda's fighters. However, bin Laden and other top leaders escaped into the remote, mountainous border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The core of al-Qaeda's leadership relocated to Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, a lawless region difficult to control. The hunt for bin Laden then became a long-term intelligence operation. The CIA led the effort, using drones, satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and informants. For years, there were few solid leads. The trail went cold because bin Laden used a simple but effective security method. He completely cut himself off from electronic communications. He did not use the internet, mobile phones, or any device that could be tracked. Information was passed only through trusted human couriers. The key breakthrough came in 2010. For years, intelligence agencies had been tracking a small network of al-Qaeda couriers. One courier, known by the nickname Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, was eventually identified as a trusted protege of bin Laden. After intense surveillance, CIA operatives followed this courier in August 2010. He led them not to a remote cave, but to a large, fortified compound in the Pakistani city of Abbottabad. This was surprising, as Abbottabad is a quiet garrison town home to a major Pakistani military academy. The compound was unusual. It was 3 stories tall, with walls as high as 5.5 meters, 18 feet, topped with barbed wire. It had no internet or telephone lines. The residents burned their own trash instead of putting it out for collection. The 3rd floor had a private terrace shielded by a high wall. Through satellite photos and on-the-ground surveillance, analysts concluded a high-value target was living there in secrecy. They referred to him as the Pacer, because a tall man was often seen walking laps in the compound's garden. Through careful analysis, the CIA became confident, though not certain, that this man was Osama bin Laden. President Barack Obama was briefed. In early 2011, he authorized the planning of two options: a precision bombing raid or a ground assault by U.S. Special Forces. He chose the ground assault to obtain definitive proof of bin Laden's identity. The mission, codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, was assigned to the U.S. Navy's SEAL Team 6. On May 1, 2011, two stealth Black Hawk helicopters carrying SEALs took off from a base in Afghanistan. They entered Pakistani airspace without Pakistan's knowledge. The helicopters landed inside and near the Abbottabad compound just after midnight on May 2nd, local time. One helicopter experienced mechanical failure and made a hard landing, but no one was hurt. The SEALs breached the compound walls. They cleared the first floor, encountering and killing the courier and his brother. They moved up to the second and third floors. On the top floor, they entered a bedroom. Inside, they found Osama bin Laden. He was shot and killed during the engagement. A woman in the room was injured. The entire raid took approximately 40 minutes. The SEALs collected computers, hard drives, documents, and other materials from the compound. They took bin Laden's body with them. After the SEALs departed on a backup helicopter, they flew to a U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, in the Arabian Sea. There, bin Laden's body was positively identified using multiple methods, including DNA comparison with a relative. Following Islamic rites, his body was washed, placed in a white sheet, and buried at sea from the deck of the ship. This was done to prevent any grave site from becoming a shrine. President Obama announced the news to the world that same day, May 1st, in the United States. In Pakistan, the government stated it had not been informed of the raid beforehand and called it an unauthorized unilateral action. The discovery of bin Laden living so close to a major military institution raised serious questions about whether elements within Pakistan had known of his presence, which Pakistan denied. The documents seized from the compound provided a vast intelligence treasure trove, revealing Al-Qaeda's operations, plans, and finances. This led to further counterterrorism operations around the world. Al-Qaeda did not immediately collapse, but it was severely weakened. Bin Laden was succeeded as leader by his longtime deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri. For the families of the thousands of victims of Al-Qaeda's attacks, bin Laden's death brought a sense of justice, though it did not end their grief. The United States formally ended its combat mission in Afghanistan in 2014, but the war against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates continued globally. Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed in a U.S. drone strike in Kabul, Afghanistan, in 2022. The story of the hunt for Osama bin Laden closed a major chapter in the long history of modern counterterrorism. Story 5. Vernon Lamont Smith was born on April 7, 1972, in Toledo, Ohio. He grew up in the city's central neighborhoods. His biological father was not present in his life. His mother, Verna, later married a man named Willie Smith, who became Vernon's stepfather. Willie Smith was a father figure to Vernon and his younger brother for several years. The home life was difficult. Vernon's stepfather, Willie, was physically abusive towards Verna. He would beat her in front of the children. Vernon saw his mother with black eyes and bruises. This violence in the home happened many times. After years of this abuse, Verna separated from Willie Smith. The divorce was very hard on Vernon. He felt devastated by the breakup of the family. After the divorce, Verna raised her sons alone. She supported the family with welfare payments. Money was always tight. Vernon's experience at school was not good. He began getting into fights when he was about 10 or 12 years old. He was suspended from school many times for fighting. He attended a number of different schools. He did not do well academically, and he had trouble handling his feelings. A psychologist would later say that Vernon learned early to solve problems by physically intimidating others. When Vernon was 14 years old, he fathered a child. He was not prepared to be a father. As a young man, he spent most of his time on the streets of his neighborhood. He became familiar with street life and how to survive in that environment. An uncle later said Vernon seemed like a nice young man, but was a victim of his society, cast aside like many other young people. In October 1990, when Vernon was 18, he married a woman named Grace. He was in jail at the time of the wedding. The couple had a child together. They moved to Texas because they wanted a different environment. They struggled financially and lived on welfare. The change did not work, so they moved back to Toledo to be near family. Grace became pregnant with their second child. Vernon did not have a steady job. He was often around friends who were involved in petty crime. He had a history of minor offenses. A psychologist who evaluated him later said Vernon was of average intelligence. The psychologist also said Vernon had a defect in his ability to handle stress and strong feelings. The psychologist believed that when Vernon was in high-stress situations, he could temporarily lose touch with reality. Vernon did not know how to manage his emotions in a healthy way. On the afternoon of May 26, 1993, Vernon Smith was 21 years old. He was agitated and had no money. He spent part of the day with his wife, Grace. They went to see a movie at the theater. The movie was called Menace to Society. It was a film about life in the inner city. The opening scene of the movie showed a robbery. In the scene, a young black man argued with a store owner who was not black. The young man then angrily shot the store owner. Vernon and Grace watched this movie together. After the movie, Vernon left to meet up with some friends in a local park. That same afternoon, Vernon Smith met two friends at a dirt basketball court in a park at the corner of Highland and Maplewood in Toledo. The friends were Herbert Bryson and Lamont Layson. The three young men talked about needing money. They used the phrase hitting a lick, which meant they were planning to commit a robbery. They decided to do it together. They got into Herbert Bryson's car. Vernon Smith gave directions. He told Bryson to drive to the corner of Woodstock and Avondale. He had a specific place in mind, the Woodstock Market, a small carry-out store. Lamont Layson's role was to stay in the car as the driver. He waited behind the wheel while Vernon Smith and Herbert Bryson walked toward the store. A man named Jeremiah Bishop was standing outside a house 2 doors down from the Woodstock Market. He saw 2 men, Smith and Bryson, enter the store. Inside the store, the owner, Sohail Darwish, was working behind the counter. A friend of his, Osan Tabub, was visiting him and was also behind the counter. Darwish was 28 years old. He was a Palestinian man who had been raised in Saudi Arabia and had immigrated to Toledo. He owned and operated this small market. When Smith and Bryson entered, Bryson acted like a normal customer. He asked about a specific type of beer. Sohail Darwish came around the counter to help. He walked to a cooler, took out a large 40-ounce bottle of beer, and placed it on the counter. Bryson took another bottle from the cooler and placed it next to the first one. Darwish went to the cash register to ring up the sale. At that moment, Vernon Smith pulled out a black handgun. He pointed it at Darwish and said, "Open the cash register, motherfucker." Darwish immediately put his hands in the air to show he would not resist. Herbert Bryson then moved behind the counter. He tried to open the cash register himself by pressing buttons, but he could not get it open. Bryson then ordered Darwish to open it. Darwish complied and opened the cash register. He then put his hands back up in the air. With the register open, Vernon Smith then gave another order. He told Darwish, "Move and empty your wallet, motherfucker." As Sohail Darwish began to reach for his wallet to hand over his money, Vernon Smith fired the gun. He shot Darwish 1 time. The bullet hit Darwish in the upper left side of his chest. Smith then pointed the gun at Osan Tabub and ordered him to empty his own wallet. Tabub did so. Smith and Bryson took all the money from the register and the wallets. Then they ran out of the store. Sohail Darwish, after being shot, was able to push a silent alarm button behind the counter before he fell to the floor. He bled heavily from the gunshot wound. The bullet had severed a major artery. Osun Tabub could not help him. Darwish died from blood loss on the floor of his store. Outside, Smith and Bryson ran back to Bryson's car where Lamont Layson was waiting. Layson saw that Smith was still holding the gun in his hand as he got into the car. As they drove away, Smith said, "Dang, I forgot the beer." He was referring to the bottles they had left on the counter. Bryson asked Smith why he had shot the store owner. Smith replied that he shot him in the arm because he moved too slow. Smith said, "He took too long opening the cash register." Smith then made another statement. He said, "Fuck him, he in our neighborhood anyway. He shouldn't be in our neighborhood with a store, no way." The three men drove to a different location. They counted the money they had stolen. It was more than $400. They also had taken food stamps from the register. Smith and Bryson split the cash between themselves. They gave all the stolen food stamps and $50 of the cash to Lamont Layson for his role as the driver. After splitting the money, they went their separate ways. Sohail Darwish was found dead in his store. The police were called. They spoke to the witness, Osun Tabub, who described the two robbers and the shooting in detail. For about 2 weeks, the police investigation continued without a break in the case. Then, on June 9, 1993, a police detective named Dennis Richardson received a tip. The tip indicated that some people who might be involved in a homicide were already in jail in the Sandusky County Jail, which was in a neighboring county. Detective Richardson put together a set of 8 photographs of different men, called a photo array. One of the photos was of Herbert Bryson. He showed this array to Osun Tabub. The next day, Tabub looked at the photographs. He pointed to the picture of Herbert Bryson. He told the detective that this was not the man who had the gun, but that it was the other guy who was in the store. This identification gave the police a starting point. Detective Richardson then checked police computer records. The records showed that a known associate of Herbert Bryson was Vernon Smith. Richardson made a second photo array. This one included a picture of Vernon Smith. He showed it to Tabub. Tabub immediately pointed to Smith's photo. He identified Vernon Smith as the gunman who had shot Sohail Darwish. Based on this identification, the police arrested Vernon Smith. They also arrested Herbert Bryson and Lamont Layson. All three were charged by a grand jury. Vernon Smith was charged with 1 count of aggravated murder for killing someone during a robbery. Because the murder happened during a robbery, the charge included a death penalty specification, meaning the state could ask for the death penalty if he was convicted. He was also charged with 3 separate counts of aggravated robbery for robbing the store, robbing Darwish, and robbing Tabub. Bryson and Layson were charged with similar crimes. Before the trial, the prosecution offered Vernon Smith a plea deal. The deal would have allowed him to plead guilty in exchange for a sentence that was not the death penalty. His court-appointed lawyers advised him to take the deal. Smith refused. He insisted on going to trial. The trial began in March of 1994. To get a lesser sentence, Herbert Bryson and Lamont Layson both agreed to plead guilty and to testify against Vernon Smith. At the trial, Bryson told the jury exactly what happened inside the store. He stated that Smith was the one who pulled the trigger. Lamont Layson testified about what Smith said in the car after the robbery, including Smith's comment about the store owner not belonging in the neighborhood. Osun Tabub also testified, identifying Smith as the shooter. Vernon Smith's defense lawyers did not call any witnesses. They did not even give a closing argument to the jury. They seemed to be saving their effort for the penalty phase, hoping to convince the jury to choose a life sentence instead of death. The jury found Vernon Smith guilty on all charges. Next came the penalty phase to decide if Smith would get the death penalty or life in prison. His lawyers now called witnesses. Smith's wife, Grace, testified. She said that 1 or 2 days after the murder, Smith broke down crying and told her the shooting was an accident. His mother, Verna, testified about his difficult childhood and the abuse she suffered. A psychologist, Dr. Robert Call, testified that Smith had a mental defect that made it hard for him to handle stress, and that he might have been influenced by the movie he saw that day. A Muslim counselor from the jail testified that Smith had converted to Islam and now showed remorse. The jury was instructed to weigh the aggravating factor, the murder during a robbery, against the mitigating factors, his background, his mental state, his remorse. The jury decided that the aggravation outweighed the mitigation. They recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed and sentenced Vernon Smith to death. He was also given additional prison terms for the robberies. Smith appealed his conviction and sentence all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court. His lawyers argued many points, including that his trial lawyers were ineffective. The Ohio Supreme Court reviewed the case and affirmed the conviction and the death sentence in the year 2000. All further appeals, including in federal courts, were eventually denied. While in prison on death row, Vernon Smith converted to Islam and legally changed his name to Abdullah Sharif Kazim Mahdi. He spent years filing appeals. The governor of Ohio, Ted Strickland, was asked to grant clemency and change the sentence to life in prison. On January 6, 2010, Governor Strickland denied the request. The execution was scheduled for the next morning, January 7, 2010, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Mahdi followed Islamic traditions the night before. He fasted and then ate a last meal of dates and tea. He used a miswak stick to clean his teeth and olive oil for his beard. At 10:20 a.m., the execution process began. Ohio had recently changed its method to use a single, large dose of a sedative drug. The prison staff found a vein without trouble. As he was prepared, Mahdi silently mouthed words. The warden asked if he had a final statement. Mahdi recited an Islamic prayer in Arabic 4 times aloud. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. He then fell silent. The drug was administered. He took a deep breath, fell unconscious, and was pronounced dead at 10:28 a.m. Watching the execution were Charlotte Darwish, the widow of Sohail Darwish, and her 2 daughters, Dolly and Mona. Dolly had been a baby when her father was killed. Mona was born after his death. They had come to see justice carried out. Charlotte Darwish said later that she found some comfort in hearing Mahdi recite the Islamic prayer before he died. Herbert Bryson, who pleaded guilty, was sentenced to 8 to 25 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. Lamont Layson, who also pleaded guilty, was sentenced to 10 to 25 years for aggravated robbery and was paroled in 2001. Charlotte Darwish later remarried and moved with her family to another state, closing the chapter on the tragedy that began in the Woodstock market. The execution of Abdullah Sharif Kazim Mahdi, formerly Vernon Smith, ended a 17-year legal process that began with a senseless robbery and the murder of a store owner who was simply doing his job. Story 6. Malcolm Rent Johnson was born in 1958. He spent his early childhood in Oklahoma City. His family life was unstable and marked by hardship. His parents' marriage ended in divorce when he was still a boy. This breakup split the family. After the divorce, Malcolm's life became divided between 2 states and 2 parents. For a time, Malcolm lived with his father in Oklahoma. This arrangement did not last. As a young teenager, Malcolm decided to run away. He left his father's home and traveled to Chicago, Illinois. He went there to live with his mother, who had moved there after the divorce. The change was significant. He went from Oklahoma City to a major city like Chicago. Life in Chicago was difficult for Malcolm. He did not adjust well to his new surroundings. He struggled in school and did not finish his high school education. Without the structure of school, he spent much of his time on the streets. His behavior began to attract the attention of the police. When Malcolm was 15 years old, he was arrested by Chicago police. The arrest was for carrying a concealed weapon. He was found with a gun. This was his first serious encounter with the law as a juvenile. It was a sign of his increasing troubles. As he got older, his criminal activities became more serious. By the time he was 19, in 1977, he faced very grave charges. He was arrested and accused of attacking 2 different women. The charges were for rape and armed robbery. In court, he pleaded guilty to these crimes. Because of his guilty plea, he was convicted for the 2 rapes and the 2 robberies. The court sentenced him to serve time in an Illinois state prison. Malcolm spent several years in the Illinois prison system. Eventually, the Illinois Parole Board reviewed his case. They decided to grant him parole. This meant he could be released from prison under certain conditions. One of the conditions of his parole was that he had to report to a parole officer and stay out of trouble. The parole authorities allowed him a special consideration. They gave him permission to leave Illinois and return to Oklahoma. The reason for this move was to be closer to family members who lived there. In early 1981, Malcolm Rent Johnson, now a 23-year-old parolee, moved back to Oklahoma City. He moved into an apartment there. He was supposed to follow the rules of his parole, which included not committing new crimes and not possessing weapons. Malcolm Rent Johnson lived in his Oklahoma City apartment for several months after moving from Illinois. On October 27, 1981, a 76-year-old woman named Ura Alma Thompson was in her apartment in Oklahoma City. She lived alone. Her apartment was not far from where Johnson lived. At some point during that day, Johnson entered Ura Thompson's apartment. The exact way he entered was not proven, but there was no sign of a forced break-in. This suggests he may have knocked on the door and she let him in, or he found another way inside without breaking a door or window. Once inside, Johnson attacked Ura Thompson. He hit her in the head and face. He then raped her. During the attack, Ura Thompson could not breathe. The medical examiner later said she died from asphyxiation. This means something stopped her from getting air. It could have been from pressure on her chest during the assault, or because Johnson used his hand to cover her mouth and nose. After Ura Thompson was dead, Johnson took several items from her apartment. He stole her jewelry, including rings and a watch. He took her fur coats. He also took smaller items like a typewriter, a hand mirror, a cigarette case, key rings, and her purse. He took these stolen goods back to his own apartment. Later that same day, Ura Thompson's nephew, Frank Thompson, came to check on her. He found her body on the floor of her apartment. He called the police. The police came and saw the scene. They saw the signs of a struggle and the missing items. They began a murder investigation. Also on October 27, 1981, before the body was discovered, Oklahoma City police officers went to Johnson's apartment for a different reason. They were checking on him because he was a parolee from Illinois. They arrested him for having a handgun, which was a violation of his parole rules. When the officers were in his apartment, they saw many items that seemed expensive and out of place. They saw furs and jewelry. They took note of these items. After the police discovered Ura Thompson's body and her stolen belongings were reported missing, the police connected the items in Johnson's apartment to the crime. The police got a warrant to search his apartment properly. They found and seized Ura Thompson's typewriter, her furs, her watch, her rings, her hand mirror, her cigarette case, her key rings, and her purse. They also found a key that fit Ura Thompson's apartment door in Johnson's nightstand. The police took Johnson to the police station for questioning about the murder. Johnson told the police he did not know anything about the killing. He said he did not kill Ura Thompson. When the police talked to him about evidence, they told him that semen found in the victim's body matched his. Johnson replied, "You couldn't have found my semen in her. I didn't come." He said this because he did not believe his semen could be there. At Johnson's trial, a police chemist from the Oklahoma City Police Department named Joyce Gilchrist testified. She told the jury that semen stains found on the bedspread and pillowcase in Ura Thompson's apartment matched Johnson's blood type. She also testified that hairs found at the crime scene were consistent with Johnson's hair when looked at under a microscope. Furthermore, she said fibers from a blue cotton shirt found in Johnson's apartment matched fibers found at the scene. A neighbor of Ura Thompson also testified. The neighbor said they had seen Malcolm Johnson near Ura Thompson's apartment building around the time of the crime. Johnson's defense lawyers argued at the trial that the blue cotton shirt was a common type and the fibers could have come from anyone. They also questioned the reliability of the hair analysis. The defense did not call any witnesses of their own to testify. The jury found Malcolm Rent Johnson guilty of the rape and murder of Ura Alma Thompson. Malcolm Rent Johnson was sentenced to death for the murder of Ura Alma Thompson. He appealed his conviction multiple times over many years. His lawyers argued that mistakes were made during his trial. All of his appeals were denied by the courts. Johnson chose not to ask the state clemency board to reduce his sentence to life in prison. On January 6, 2000, Johnson was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 12:13 a.m. Before the execution, he was offered a special last meal. He ate 3 fried chicken thighs, a dozen shrimp, tater tots with ketchup, 2 slices of pecan pie, strawberry ice cream, honey and biscuits, and drank a soda. His final words were, "I'm innocent, and I've got peace in my heart, and I'm ready to go home. I'm going to heaven on a midnight train." For over a year after the execution, no major questions about the case were publicly known. Then in 2001, a serious problem was discovered. This problem concerned the police chemist, Joyce Gilchrist, who had testified at Johnson's trial. Gilchrist's work in many cases was being reviewed because other scientists had questioned her methods. As part of this review, another chemist in the Oklahoma City Police Lab, Laura Scheil, examined the actual microscope slides from the Johnson case. These were the slides Gilchrist had prepared and used to support her testimony about finding semen matching Johnson's blood type. On July 30th, 2001, Scheil looked at these slides under a microscope. She found no sperm cells on them. Sperm cells do not disappear over time. If they were present in 1981, they would still be visible in 2001. Scheil's finding was confirmed by 3 other chemists in the lab. Laura Scheil wrote an internal memo to police officials on July 31st, 2001. The memo stated that the slides contained no sperm. This directly contradicted Joyce Gilchrist's trial testimony, where she said the slides showed semen consistent with Johnson. Scheil resigned from the police lab soon after, saying the work environment had become hostile because of her findings. This discovery led to a larger investigation into Joyce Gilchrist. She was fired from the Oklahoma City Police Department in September 2001. An FBI review had found she made serious errors or gave misleading testimony in several cases. Because of her faulty testimony, some men in other cases were released from prison. One man on death row had his sentence overturned. In Johnson's case, however, state officials like the Attorney General, Drew Edmondson, and the prosecutor, Bob Macy, said there was still enough other evidence to prove he was guilty. They pointed to the stolen property found in his apartment and the key to the victim's door. They said this physical evidence, separate from Gilchrist's testimony, was overwhelming. Defense lawyers and others disagreed. They argued that Gilchrist's testimony about the semen was a central part of proving the rape, which was a key factor in Johnson receiving the death penalty. They also noted that requests for modern DNA testing on the old evidence had been denied by the courts before the execution. The courts had ruled that Johnson was not eligible for such testing under the strict appeal rules for death penalty cases. Furthermore, it was revealed that some of the original physical evidence from the case had been lost by the police department or the city, making independent DNA testing impossible. A lawsuit was filed to get access to all the case records. The investigation into Joyce Gilchrist showed that she had testified beyond what the science could prove, especially about hair and fiber matches. But no official ever declared that Malcolm Rent Johnson was innocent. The state maintained he was guilty. The new information only proved that part of the scientific testimony against him was wrong. Johnson was the 20th person executed in Oklahoma since 1977. The questions about the forensic evidence in his case became part of a larger national discussion about the reliability of old scientific methods and the finality of the death penalty. The story of his execution ends with unresolved doubts about the evidence used to convict him, but with the legal process completed. The state of Oklahoma carried out the sentence based on the conviction it obtained at his trial. Story 7. David Ray Duran was born in Alabama in 1962. He grew up in a middle-class family in Jefferson County. His parents were married and both worked. The family was not rich, but they had what they needed. David lived in a house with his parents and his sibling. When David was about 12 years old, his family moved to a different area. They began living in an apartment complex. This was a change for David. Many of the other children in the apartment complex came from families with only one parent. These parents often had to work long hours. This meant the children were left without supervision for much of the time. David started to spend his after-school hours and evenings with this new group of kids. David was different from the other kids at first. He did not use bad language. He did not smoke cigarettes. He did not drink alcohol or use drugs. The other kids saw him as an outsider because of this. They did not fully accept him into their group. David felt lonely and wanted to fit in. He wanted to have friends. He felt pressure to be like the other kids to gain their friendship. At the age of 12, David made a decision to change his behavior. He decided to do the things the other kids did. He smoked his first cigarette. He drank his first beer. He also used marijuana for the first time. He began to use bad language regularly. After he did these things, the other kids started to accept him. David felt like he belonged. He now had the friends he wanted. This change in behavior was important. David later wrote that it was not just the smoking or drinking that was the problem. The problem was his new attitude. He knew these actions were wrong, but he chose to do them anyway because he wanted to fit in. He chose what he wanted over what he knew was right. As David got older, his actions led to more serious problems. Smoking marijuana meant he had to buy it from someone. The people who sold marijuana often sold other, harder drugs too. By wanting to buy marijuana, David put himself into a world where other drugs were available. The same was true for alcohol. He would drink and then want to use drugs to feel a stronger effect. David began to use more kinds of drugs. If his drug seller did not have marijuana, the seller would offer other pills or drugs instead. David would often buy these other drugs. He used drugs called Quaaludes and Valium. He also used a powerful drug called LSD, which is also known as acid. He used LSD very often, sometimes several times a week. David's drug use became a big part of his life. He even used a dangerous drug called heroin, even though he did not like the way it made him feel. He mixed different drugs together. One time, he mixed heroin, other stimulants, and alcohol. This mixture was so dangerous that his heart stopped. Another person had to perform CPR on him to save his life. After he finished high school, David joined the United States Army. He thought this might help change his life. However, He kept using drugs while he was in the army. He was caught smoking marijuana. Because of this, the army discharged him. This means he was forced to leave the army before his service time was complete. David returned home to Alabama. He was now in his early 20s. He did not have a good job. He spent most of his time with old friends who were also involved with drugs and alcohol. His life had no clear direction. He felt lost. The friends he had chosen years earlier were still the people he spent time with. The attitude he had chosen as a teenager, to do what he wanted, not what was right, was now a normal part of his thinking. In October of 1983, David Duran was 21 years old. He was spending most of his time with a friend named Richard Kinder, who was 17. On the evening of October 20th, they were together, driving around in David's car. They had been drinking and using drugs. David had taken LSD earlier that night. They had very little money. The idea to get money by committing a robbery was formed between them. David had a pistol with him. Later that night, a 16-year-old boy named Charles Leonard was on a date. He was using his father's Oldsmobile car. His date was a 16-year-old girl named Kathleen Bedsole. They had left her house around 9 p.m. They were planning to visit Halloween haunted house events in the Birmingham, Alabama area. Charles drove to a quiet, secluded cul-de-sac in the Huffman area to talk. David and Richard, in David's car, saw the Oldsmobile parked. They drove into the cul-de-sac. They backed out and then parked their own car. The two men walked over to the teenager's car. David approached the driver's side window holding his pistol. He ordered Charles and Kathleen to get out of the car. He told them if they did as they were told, they would not be hurt. Richard Kinder stood by, now holding a knife. David, with the gun, and Richard, with the knife, forced the two teenagers to the back of the Oldsmobile. David opened the trunk. He told Charles and Kathleen to get inside. The teenagers, fearing for their lives, got into the trunk. David then closed the trunk lid, locking them inside in the dark. David and Richard then got into the Oldsmobile. David drove it, with Richard as a passenger, a short distance to a nearby lot. They left David's own car parked at this lot. Now both men were in the stolen Oldsmobile with the teenagers trapped in the trunk. David began to drive. He drove onto a highway and traveled for some time. David and Richard needed money. They decided to rob a drive-in restaurant. David drove the Oldsmobile to the service window of a restaurant. Richard Kinder was supposed to rob it. However, Richard made a mistake. He showed the pistol to the restaurant employee too early, before demanding money. An employee inside shouted the word robbery. David panicked. He quickly drove the car away from the restaurant without getting any money. The failed robbery made both men nervous. They were now driving a stolen car with two people in the trunk who could identify them. They began to discuss what to do with Charles and Kathleen. They decided they could not let the teenagers go. They believed the teenagers would immediately go to the police. David and Richard agreed they had to kill the two teenagers to remove them as witnesses. David drove to a secluded area near Trussville, Alabama. It was a wooded, dark place away from homes. He stopped the car. He and Richard got out and opened the trunk. Charles and Kathleen were still inside. The men ordered them to climb out. Richard Kinder took a length of rope. He tied Charles's and Kathleen's wrists together, binding them to each other. While they were tied up, Richard took Kathleen Bedsole's purse. He opened it and removed the money inside. He found two $20 bills, which was $40 total. Kathleen's father had given her this money for her date. Richard put the money in his pocket. David and Richard then stepped a few feet away to talk quietly. They confirmed their decision. David would shoot both teenagers. David walked back toward the tied-up couple. He was holding his pistol. He stood about 7 feet away from them. Charles and Kathleen were turned so that Kathleen had her back to David. David raised the pistol and aimed at the back of Kathleen's head. He squeezed the trigger. The gun fired one time. The bullet struck Kathleen in the back of the head. The force of the shot caused her to collapse suddenly. Because she was tied to Charles, he was pulled down to the ground with her. David then lowered the gun and pointed it at Charles, who was now on the ground. David fired the pistol several more times. 4 more bullets struck Charles Leonard. He was hit in his legs, his hip, and his chest. David then stopped shooting. He believed both teenagers were now dead. David walked back to the car. He and Richard Kinder got into the Oldsmobile. David drove them away from the scene, leaving the 2 bodies in the woods. However, Charles Leonard was not dead. He was badly wounded and in great pain, but he was conscious. He managed to move his arms. He worked to loosen the rope that tied him to Kathleen. After some struggle, he freed himself from the knots. He saw that Kathleen was not moving and was very badly injured. Despite his 3 gunshot wounds, Charles forced himself to stand up. He began to walk through the woods, looking for help. He walked a long way until he came to a house. The people who lived there, named Doser, saw him and let him inside. They immediately called the sheriff's office for help. Police and ambulance services were sent to the Doser home. Police and ambulance crews arrived at the Doser home, where Charles Leonard had found help. Charles was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery. Before he was taken away, he was able to give the sheriff's deputies a brief description of what had happened. He described the 2 men who had attacked them. He described the car, which was his father's Oldsmobile. He told them his girlfriend, Kathleen Bedsole, was still lying shot in the woods near Trussville. Deputies immediately began searching the area Charles described. They found Kathleen Bedsole at the scene in the woods. She was dead. Medical examiners would later determine the gunshot to the back of her head had paralyzed her and caused her to suffocate. Other deputies put out a radio alert with the description of the stolen Oldsmobile and the 2 suspects. A different sheriff's deputy, who was patrolling the roads in the Huffman area where the crime began, heard the radio alert. Shortly after, this deputy saw 2 young men walking alongside a road. They matched the description. The deputy stopped his car and questioned them. These 2 men were David Duran and Richard Kinder. They were arrested and taken into custody. Charles Leonard survived his surgery. While he was recovering in the hospital, detectives brought him a series of photographs to look at. This is called a photo lineup. Charles looked at the photos and immediately identified David Duran as the man with the pistol who had shot him and Kathleen. He also identified Richard Kinder. With this identification, detectives began to question David Duran. After being told of his legal rights, Duran agreed to talk. He confessed to his role in the crimes. He confessed a second time in a more formal, recorded statement. In his confession, he admitted to kidnapping the teenagers, robbing them, and shooting them. He then led detectives back to the secluded crime scene in Trussville. He showed them exactly where the shooting happened. He also led them to a hiding place near the scene, where he had stashed the murder weapon, the pistol. The gun was recovered. David Duran and Richard Kinder were both charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Because a killing happened during a kidnapping and robbery, it was a death penalty case under Alabama law. Their trials were separate. Richard Kinder, who was 17, agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to murder and robbery. In exchange for his plea and his agreement to testify against Duran, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David Duran's trial began in March of 1984. Charles Leonard, now out of the hospital, testified in court. He clearly described the events and identified Duran as the shooter. Duran's own confession was also presented as evidence. The defense lawyer did not dispute most of the facts. The only point he argued was whether Duran specifically intended to kill Kathleen Bedsole when he shot her. The jury found David Duran guilty of capital murder. After the guilty verdict, the same jury had to decide on the punishment. They recommended the death sentence. The judge in the case, Judge Joseph Jasper, was about to formally impose the sentence when he learned something new. He discovered that his late wife was a very distant relative of David Duren. Judge Jasper decided to remove himself from the case to avoid any appearance of bias. A new judge, Judge James Garrett, was assigned. Judge Garrett held a new sentencing hearing. He reviewed all the trial evidence and listened to new witnesses. David Duren did not try to claim he was innocent. He spoke about his difficult childhood and his drug use. Judge Garrett considered these as possible mitigating factors or reasons for a lesser sentence. However, he also considered the aggravating factors. The murder was committed during a kidnapping and a robbery, and it was especially cruel. Judge Garrett decided the aggravating factors were stronger. In September 1984, he formally sentenced David Duren to death by electrocution. After the sentence, David Duren began the long process of appeals that is required in death penalty cases. His lawyers argued various legal points over many years. All of the appeals were eventually rejected by the courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. While on death row, Duren changed significantly. He became a born-again Christian in 1986. He was baptized. He wrote letters and articles warning young people about the dangers of drug use and peer pressure. He said he felt great shame for his crime. As his execution date neared in 1999, David Duren decided not to fight it any longer. He said dragging out the legal process for more years would not be fair to the victim's family or his own family. He said he believed the death penalty was the appropriate punishment for what he had done. He said he was not afraid to die because of his religious faith. The execution was set for January 7, 2000, at Holman Prison in Atmore, Alabama. The method was electrocution. On the day before, Duren spoke by telephone with Charles Leonard. Leonard had become a Baptist minister. Duren told him he was sorry and had asked God for forgiveness. On the morning of the execution, Duren was calm. He did not make a final statement. He was strapped into the electric chair and executed at 12:09 a.m. Richard Kinder remained in prison, serving his sentence of life without parole. Charles Leonard continued his life as a minister, stating that while he believed justice was done, he found no joy in the execution. Kathleen Bedsoul's parents lived with the loss of their daughter. The case was closed, and the final sentence was carried out. Story 8. Vernon Lamont Smith was born on April 7, 1972, in Toledo, Ohio. He grew up in a neighborhood in the central part of the city. His mother's name was Verna Smith. His biological father was not present in his life. Vernon's mother later married a man named Willie Smith, who became Vernon's stepfather. Willie Smith was not a kind man. He was physically violent. Vernon, as a child, saw his stepfather hit his mother on several occasions. These incidents left his mother with bruises and black eyes. The violence happened in front of Vernon and his younger brother. This environment was stressful and frightening for a young boy. After several years, Vernon's mother separated from Willie Smith because of the abuse. The end of this marriage was very hard on Vernon. He felt the loss deeply, even though his stepfather had been violent. Verna Smith raised her two sons alone after the separation. The family did not have much money. They lived on welfare payments from the government. Vernon's childhood was not easy. The neighborhood where he lived had many problems. There were not many good opportunities for young people there. Vernon attended local schools. He had trouble in school from a young age. He got into fights with other students. When he was about 10 or 12 years old, he was suspended from school for fighting. This happened many times. By his own count, he was suspended about 6 times. His experience with education was not positive. He did not do well in his classes. He eventually dropped out of school in the 10th grade. He did not earn a high school diploma. As a teenager and young adult, Vernon did not have steady work. The jobs he could get did not pay well and did not last long. He worked at a car wash for a time. He He struggled to make enough money to live. For a while, he moved to Texas with a woman named Grace. He had met Grace earlier, and they had a child together when Vernon was still very young. They moved to Texas because they wanted a different life, but they still struggled financially. They had to rely on welfare. Eventually, they moved back to Toledo. Back in Toledo, Vernon spent a lot of his time with friends in the neighborhood. A common place for him to go was a dirt basketball court in a park at the corner of Highland and Maplewood Streets. He would meet his friends there. Two of these friends were Herbert Bryson and Lamont Layson. They were people he had known for a long time. Together, they would talk and pass the time. Vernon did not have a clear path or plan for his future. He was adrift. His social life revolved around the streets of his neighborhood. He did not have positive role models or a stable job to guide him. He was a young man who had grown up seeing violence at home, had failed in school, and could not find a good job. These experiences shaped his outlook on life. He was 21 years old in the spring of 1993, living day by day with no particular direction. On the afternoon of May 26, 1993, Vernon Smith met his friends Herbert Bryson and Lamont Layson at the dirt basketball court in the park. The three young men were talking with nothing particular to do. During their conversation, one of them brought up the idea of hitting a lick. This was slang for committing a robbery. They agreed they wanted to get some money. Vernon Smith suggested a target. He told the others about a small grocery store, the Woodstock Market, located on the corner of Woodstock and Avondale. He said it would be a good place to rob. The three men got into Herbert Bryson's car. Bryson was driving. Lamont Layson sat in the front passenger seat. Vernon Smith sat in the back. Smith gave Bryson directions to the store. When they arrived near the store, they made a plan. Lamont Layson would stay in the car as the getaway driver. Vernon Smith and Herbert Bryson would go inside to commit the robbery. Smith was carrying a black handgun. He had this gun with him when they left the basketball court. Bryson was not armed. Smith and Bryson walked from the car to the Woodstock Market and entered the store. Inside, they saw two men behind the counter. One was the store's owner, Sohail Darwish. The other was a friend of Darwish named Osun Tabub, who was just visiting. To avoid looking suspicious, Bryson acted like a normal customer. He asked Darwish about a specific type of beer. Sohail Darwish came out from behind the counter to help. He walked to a cooler, took out a large 40-ounce bottle of beer, and placed it on the counter. Herbert Bryson also picked up a bottle of beer and put it next to the first one. Darwish then went back behind the counter to ring up the sale on the cash register. This was the moment Vernon Smith chose to start the robbery. While Darwish was focused on the register, Smith pulled out his black gun. He pointed it at Darwish and said, "Open the cash register, motherfucker." Sohail Darwish immediately put his hands in the air to show he would not resist. Herbert Bryson then walked behind the counter. He tried to open the cash register himself by pushing buttons, but he could not get it to open. Bryson then ordered Darwish to open it. Darwish, with his hands still up, leaned over and opened the cash register for them. After he opened it, Darwish put his hands back up in the air. With the register open, Vernon Smith then gave another order. He told Darwish, "Move and empty your wallet, motherfucker." Sohail Darwish began to reach slowly for his back pocket to get his wallet. As he was doing this, Vernon Smith fired the gun. He shot Darwish one time from a short distance away. The bullet hit Darwish in the upper left side of his chest. Smith then turned the gun on Osun Tabub, the visitor, and ordered him to empty his own wallet. Tabub did as he was told. With the money from the register and the wallets, Smith and Bryson ran out of the store. They left behind the 2 bottles of beer on the counter. As they fled, Sohail Darwish, though badly wounded, was able to push a silent alarm button behind the counter before he collapsed onto the floor. Smith and Bryson ran back to the waiting car and got in. Lamont Layson, who was waiting behind the wheel, saw that Vernon Smith was still holding the gun in his hand. As Bryson drove them away from the store, Smith said, "Dang, I forgot the beer." He was annoyed that they had left the bottles behind. Bryson asked Smith why he had shot the store owner. Smith replied that he had shot the man in the arm because he moved too slow. Smith said Darwish had taken too long opening the cash register. Smith then added, "Fuck him, he in our neighborhood anyway. He shouldn't be in our neighborhood with a store, no way." He showed no regret for the shooting. Later, the three men met up to divide what they had stolen. The robbery had netted over $400 in cash, along with some food stamps. Vernon Smith and Herbert Bryson split the cash between themselves. They gave all of the food stamps, plus $50, to Lamont Layson for his role as the driver. Sohail Darwish did not survive. The single gunshot wound was severe. The bullet had severed a major artery near his shoulder. He bled to death on the floor of his store before medical help could arrive. He was 28 years old. He left behind a wife, Charlotte, and a baby daughter named Dolly. His wife was also pregnant with their second child. The silent alarm that Sohail Darwish pushed alerted the police. Officers arrived at the Woodstock market and found Darwish deceased. They also found the witness, Osun Tabub, who was very upset but able to describe what had happened. Tabub told the police that two men had robbed the store and that one of them, a young black man, had shot Darwish. He gave a description of the shooter and the other robber. The police investigation began. They collected evidence from the scene, including the 2 bottles of beer left on the counter. They spoke to neighbors. One neighbor, Jeremiah Bishop, who lived 2 houses away, told police he had seen 2 men enter the store around the time of the crime. For about 2 weeks, the case had no strong leads. Then on June 9, 1993, a police detective named Dennis Richardson received a tip. The tip suggested that some people who might be involved in a homicide were already in jail in the Sandusky County Jail, which was in a nearby county. Detective Richardson learned that one of these people was Herbert Bryson. Bryson had been arrested on an unrelated charge. Detective Richardson put together a set of 8 photographs called a photo array. One of the photos was of Herbert Bryson. He showed this array to Osun Tabub. Tabub looked at the photos and pointed to Bryson's picture. He told the detective that this was not the man with the gun, but that it was the other man who had been in the store. This positive identification gave the police their first suspect. Using computer records, Detective Richardson then looked for people known to be associates of Herbert Bryson. The records showed that Vernon Smith was a known associate. Richardson compiled a second photo array, this time including a picture of Vernon Smith. He showed this new set of photos to Tabub. Immediately, Tabub pointed to Smith's photo. He identified Smith as the man who had held the gun and shot Sohail Darwish. Based on this identification, the police arrested Vernon Smith. A grand jury later indicted Smith, Herbert Bryson, and Lamont Layson. Smith was charged with aggravated murder for causing Darwish's death during an aggravated robbery. Because a killing happened during a robbery, the charges included a death penalty specification, meaning the state could seek the death sentence if Smith was convicted. He was also charged with multiple counts of aggravated robbery. Before the trial, the prosecution offered Vernon Smith a plea bargain. The deal would have allowed him to plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of life in prison, avoiding the death penalty. Smith's defense lawyers advised him to take this deal. Smith refused. He insisted on going to trial. Herbert Bryson and Lamont Layson, however, chose to make deals with the prosecution. They both pleaded guilty to their roles in the crime. In exchange for lighter sentences, they agreed to testify truthfully against Vernon Smith at his trial. Vernon Smith's trial began in March of 1994. The prosecution's main witnesses were Herbert Bryson, Lamont Layson, and Osun Tabub. Bryson and Layson explained how the robbery was planned and described Smith shooting Darwish. Tabo again identified Smith as the shooter. The defense lawyers did not call any witnesses of their own. They also chose not to give a closing argument to the jury. The jury found Vernon Smith guilty on all charges, including the aggravated murder charge with the death penalty specification. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved into a separate sentencing phase to decide if Smith would receive the death penalty. During this phase, Smith's lawyers presented mitigating evidence. Smith's wife, Grace, his mother, Verna, and an uncle and aunt testified about his difficult childhood. A psychologist, Robert Call, testified that Smith had a troubled upbringing and suffered from mental health issues, though he could not give a specific diagnosis because Smith had stopped cooperating with his evaluation. The jury considered this evidence but recommended that Smith be sentenced to death. The trial judge agreed and imposed the death sentence. Vernon Smith began a long series of appeals. His lawyers argued that his trial attorneys were ineffective. They claimed the lawyers should have questioned potential jurors about racial bias, because the crime involved a black shooter and an Arab victim. Higher courts, including the Ohio Supreme Court and later federal courts, reviewed this claim and rejected it. They ruled that the decision on how to conduct jury questioning was a matter of trial strategy and not proof of incompetent lawyering. While in prison on death row, Vernon Smith converted to the Islamic faith. He legally changed his name to Abdullah Sharif Kazim Mahdi. His appeals continued for nearly 16 years, but all were ultimately unsuccessful. The governor of Ohio denied a final request for clemency in January 2010. On January 7, 2010, Abdullah Sharif Kazim Mahdi, formerly Vernon Smith, was executed by lethal injection at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. The execution used a single drug, a powerful anesthetic. Before the execution, he was given a final meal of dates and tea, according to his religious customs. When asked for a final statement, he recited an Islamic prayer in Arabic 4 times, which translates to, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet." He was pronounced dead at 10:28 a.m. Witnessing the execution were Charlotte Darwish, the widow of Sohail Darwish, and her 2 daughters, Dolly and Mona. Mona, who had been unborn at the time of her father's murder, was 16 years old and became the youngest person to witness an execution in Ohio in the modern era. Charlotte Darwish said afterwards that she found some comfort in hearing Smith recite the Islamic prayer. As for the other 2 men involved, Herbert Bryson was sentenced to 8 to 25 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. Lamont Layson was sentenced to 10 to 25 years for aggravated robbery. He was paroled in 2001. Charlotte Darwish eventually remarried, closed the Woodstock market, and moved with her family to Alabama. The legal process concluded with the execution of the man who fired the fatal shot, bringing a final end to the case that began on an afternoon at a neighborhood store. Story 9. Kenneth Mosley was born on September 7, 1958, in Flint, Michigan. He was an African-American man. When he was still a young child, his family moved to the state of Arkansas. They lived in a rural area and were very poor. His family worked as farm laborers on a plantation. This was during a time of segregation in the South, which meant life was harder for black families like his. Kenneth's early life was difficult. The work on the farm was hard, and the pay was very low. As a child, he also worked in the fields. The family was exposed to toxic pesticides, which are chemicals used to kill insects on crops. These chemicals can be harmful to people. His home life was also troubled. He grew up in an environment of abuse and violence. He attended local schools but did not finish high school. He left school after completing the 11th grade. This is often called dropping out. With little education, his options for work were limited. He moved from job to job, often working as a laborer. A laborer does physical work, like loading and unloading goods or helping on construction sites. One of his known jobs was at a Coca-Cola bottling plant. As a young man, Kenneth Mosley got married. He was a member of a church, but he developed serious personal problems. He began to suffer from depression. Depression is a condition that makes a person feel very sad and hopeless for a long time. To deal with these feelings, he started using drugs. He used cocaine. His drug use became an addiction. An addiction is when a person cannot stop using a substance even when it hurts their life. His drug addiction caused many problems. He lost his job at the Coca-Cola plant because he failed a drug test. The church removed him from its membership because of his behavior related to drugs. His marriage suffered. He needed money to buy drugs, but he had no job. This lack of money and his addiction led him to steal. He began committing thefts and robberies to get money. He was arrested several times. Once, he was arrested for stealing items from a Home Depot store and then returning them to get cash. Another time, he was arrested for having marijuana and illegal knives. However, he was never convicted and sent to prison for these earlier crimes. A conviction means being found guilty in court. He had no prior prison record. In the months before February 1997, his life was falling apart. He was addicted to cocaine. He had no legal job. He was wanted by police for robbing a fast food restaurant in Mesquite, Texas, just 5 days before. He was living in the Dallas area, moving from place to place, focused only on getting money for drugs. On the morning of February 15, 1997, Kenneth Mosley woke up in the Dallas, Texas area. He needed money. He decided to rob a bank to get cash for drugs. He chose a Bank One branch in Garland, a suburb of Dallas. He had robbed this same bank over a month earlier and had not been caught. The day was unusually warm for February. Despite the heat, Mosley put on long, dark clothing and a dark, tight-fitting knit cap, sometimes called a toboggan. He dressed this way to hide his identity. He carried a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. He hid the gun under his shirt, tucked into the waistband of his pants. He also had a handwritten note in his pocket. The note said, "This is a hold-up, I have a gun, put money in bag." He arrived at the bank. He entered and stood in line, waiting to approach a teller. His heavy clothing on a hot day made him stand out. Several bank employees and customers noticed him because he looked suspicious. One teller looked at him closely. She recognized him. She remembered his face from the previous robbery at the same bank. She felt frightened. The teller quietly got the attention of her manager. She told the manager that the man in line was the robber from before. The manager also looked at Mosley and recognized him from security tapes of the earlier crime. The manager knew she had to act quickly. She walked back to her office without alarming Mosley. In her office, she pressed the silent alarm button. This alarm sent a signal to the police without any sound in the bank. Then she picked up the phone and called 911. She told the emergency operator that a bank robbery was in progress and that the suspect was the same man from the last robbery. After calling the police, the manager went outside to wait for them. A police car arrived very quickly. Officer David Moore, a 32-year-old uniformed police officer, got out of the car. He was a 10-year veteran of the Garland police force. The manager described Mosley to Officer Moore, pointing him out through the bank window. Officer Moore entered the bank alone and walked directly toward Mosley. Mosley was still standing in the line. Officer Moore approached him in a calm manner. He said to Mosley, "I would like to speak with you." Officer Moore then noticed that Mosley had one hand hidden, tucked into his waistband under his shirt. Officer Moore told Mosley to show him his hands. Mosley did not obey the command. Instead, Mosley began to struggle with Officer Moore. He tried to pull away. During this struggle, Mosley reached under his shirt with his hidden hand. He grabbed the handle of his 9mm pistol. He pulled the gun out. Officer Moore tried to control Mosley's arm to stop him from using the gun. The two men wrestled near the bank's front window. Several shots rang out very quickly. The gun was fired multiple times during the struggle. Witnesses inside the bank heard the loud shots and saw the two men fighting. With great force, Officer Moore shoved Mosley backward. They crashed through a large plate glass window at the front of the bank. Glass shattered everywhere. Both men fell out of the bank and landed on the ground in one of the bank's drive-through lanes. A witness across the street saw what happened next. He saw Mosley get up from the ground. Officer Moore was still on the ground. The witness saw Mosley pause and look around. Then Mosley pointed his gun down at Officer Moore, who was lying wounded. Mosley fired the gun at Officer Moore again. After this, Mosley turned and began to walk away from the bank parking lot. Officer Moore had been shot 5 times. 4 bullets had hit him in the torso. 1 bullet struck him just above the top edge of his protective vest. He was badly wounded and bleeding on the ground. As Mosley walked away, another police officer arrived at the scene. This officer saw Mosley walking and saw the gun in his hand. The officer shouted commands at Mosley. He ordered Mosley to stop, to drop the gun, and to get on the ground. Mosley stopped walking. He turned his body toward this new officer. It looked as if he was about to point the gun at the officer. The officer, believing Mosley was going to shoot, fired his own weapon 1 time. He shot Mosley in the wrist. Mosley's gun fell from his hand onto the pavement. Mosley then complied with the commands. He lay down on the ground. The officer carefully approached, handcuffed Mosley, and secured him. Paramedics arrived at the scene within minutes, but Officer David Moore died of his wounds that afternoon. Kenneth Mosley was arrested immediately at the scene of the shooting. Police officers handcuffed him after he was shot in the wrist. They found the hold-up note in his pocket. The investigation began at once. Detectives collected the gun, spoke to the many witnesses inside and outside the bank, and reviewed the bank's security camera footage. The evidence was very clear. Mosley was taken to a hospital for treatment of his gunshot wound and then to jail. On March 18, 1997, a grand jury in Dallas County formally charged Mosley with capital murder. A grand jury reviews evidence to decide if there is enough reason for a trial. Capital murder means a murder committed during another serious crime, like a robbery. His trial began in October 1997. The prosecution presented their case to the jury. They showed the security videos. They called the bank employees who saw the crime. They called the witness from across the street who saw Mosley shoot Officer Moore while he was on the ground. They also presented evidence of Mosley's prior robberies, including the robbery of the same bank weeks before and a fast food robbery just days before. Mosley's defense lawyers argued that the shooting was not intentional. Mosley testified in his own defense. He told the jury he went to the bank to rob it, but claimed he had forgotten the gun was in his pocket. He said when Officer Moore asked about his hands, he remembered the gun and pulled it out only to surrender it. He claimed the gun went off accidentally during the struggle. The prosecution pointed out that the gun fired 5 times and that Mosley stood over Officer Moore to fire the final shot. The jury did not believe Mosley's story. On October 14, 1997, the jury found Kenneth Mosley guilty of capital murder. The trial then moved to a second phase, called the punishment phase, to decide his sentence. The prosecution presented more evidence to show Mosley would be a future danger. They talked about his prior bad acts, like the sexual assault of a woman in 1985. Jail guards testified that Mosley was violent and disruptive while in jail waiting for trial. One guard said Mosley stated, "It would make my day to kill another cop." Mosley testified again during this phase. He became very angry. When the jury announced they sentenced him to death, Mosley shouted profanities at the jury and the victim's family in the courtroom. He had to be forcibly removed by bailiffs. The judge formally sentenced him to death by lethal injection on October 16, 1997. After the sentence, Mosley began a long process of appeals. An appeal is when a higher court reviews the trial to look for legal errors. His lawyers filed appeals with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. This court upheld his conviction and death sentence in May 2000. Mosley's lawyers asked the court to rehear the case, which it did, but it reaffirmed the death sentence in June 2003. His lawyers then appealed to federal courts. They filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, arguing his trial lawyers did not defend him properly. The federal district court denied this petition in 2008. The United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit also denied his appeal in December 2008. Finally, his lawyers asked the Supreme Court of the United States to review the case. The Supreme Court first issued a temporary delay of his execution in September 2009, but then decided not to hear his case in October 2009. This denial cleared the way for the execution to be scheduled. All of his appeals were now finished. The execution was set for January 7, 2010, at the state prison in Huntsville, Texas. On that day, Mosley was offered a last meal. He requested and received a large assortment of fried foods. In the afternoon, he was taken to the execution chamber. Officer Moore's widow, Sheila Moore, and a Garland police captain were among the witnesses watching through a window. The prison warden asked Mosley if he had any last words. Mosley shook his head and silently mouthed the word no. He did not look at the witnesses. The lethal injection drugs were administered. He breathed heavily a few times and then was still. He was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. Sheila Moore released a statement after the execution, saying that while justice was served, it did not heal the loss of her husband, a father, and a friend. The family had waited nearly 13 years for the legal process to end. The case was now closed.